Well, welcome. We're glad you're here as we continue on in the medieval church history period. We're looking at chapter 23 in your book. We're going to be talking about medieval learning, scholasticism in particular, and then a little bit about the worship of that time. We're going to talk about this, and first let's talk about scholasticism. The word scholastic comes through Latin from the Greek skol or shoal. This is a place of learning. You might recognize it's where we get the word school. Scholastics are learners. Now, in the 11th century, some in the church made an attempt to rationalize, this is a key word, to rationalize theology in order to strengthen faith through reason. Now, as we're going to see, that's not necessarily all bad, but it's potentially very bad. And it just depends on where it ends up going. The movement that is known in history as scholasticism. The scholastics began with an assumption that Christianity and classical Greek philosophy are both right. Okay, now think about that for a second. It's not correct. This Christianity in its true biblical form is always right. Obviously, the church by this time is all over the place, and there's a lot of problems with it. And the church is definitely not right about many things by this point. And the same is true of Greek philosophy. There are a lot of fascinating things in Greek philosophy that are true. But not everything in Greek philosophy is true. The scholastics, the Christian scholastics, made two basic errors. The first error was in seeking to make Christianity compatible with classical Greek philosophy. And there are people in our day and age who sort of discount Christianity. I mean, I don't even know how to put this. Here I'm teaching a class, I don't know how to put this. There are Christians in our day who dismiss a lot of what we understand as Christianity and say, oh, well, that's just Aristotelian stuff that's been slapped onto Christianity, and it's not true. And there's a part of that that's true, but some of those people throw out too much. And they get rid of things that are biblical because they say it's Aristotelian, which is not true. Aristotelian meaning from Aristotle. Classical Greek philosophy needs to be judged by Christianity, not the other way around. Listen, folks, we have no mandate from God to make Christianity compatible with anything. Rather, we are under a mandate to make our lives, make the church, and to the best of our ability to influence the world with the gospel, to make all things compatible with the Bible and with Christianity, which is rather different. Christianity is reasonable. Christianity is reasonable. Now, the interesting thing about when I say that is, to the natural man, there's a lot of things in Christianity that they're not reasonable. Why? Well, because as the Bible says, the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them, for they are spiritually discerned. So those who are spiritually dead in sin, there's a lot of things about Christianity that they cannot understand, just as we could not before we were born again. So Christianity is reasonable and human reason is important, but God performs miracles, for instance, that are outside the realm of human reason. So does that mean they're not true? You can't do that. And while God is not infallible, is it not true that our reason is frequently fallible? I mean, whose logic is perfect? So we can look at Christianity and say, yes, it is reasonable, and there's many logical things. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul, Saul of Tarsus, was a great logician. He was a man of tremendous intellect, and his arguments are all very logical and what have you. But the mistake is trying to insist that Christianity be compatible with Greek philosophy. One other thing about the two is that Christianity cannot be discovered by reason. The truth of the Christian gospel, the truth of Christianity, even the ability to understand the Word of God, is based on revelation, not mere reason. Now, once we receive the revelation of the truth from God, of the gospel, of who Christ is, of the truthfulness and reliability of the Bible, it is reasonable. But we don't get there through reason. We don't get there through reason. However, and again, here's again, it's this. But on the other hand, how does God communicate the revelation to us? He goes to our hearts, but He goes through our heads. We have to hear it. We have to hear the gospel preached. Hopefully well, hopefully rightly, hopefully passionately, hopefully lovingly. So there's some things that I probably muddled you up and made you even more confused than if I had not shown up today. But that's the best I can say on that. There was a real resurgence of classical Greek philosophy in the world at this time. Interest in the classics meaning Greek philosophers, and so there was in the church as well. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the church began to get on board with what had already sort of begun in the 11th century in just regular learning. People began to read the classics, Aristotle, Plato. They began to see this is profound. And, there's something about learning. Somebody once said the definition of philosophy is thinking about thinking. And philosophy it can be very heady. There's nothing wrong with the word philosophy, and philosophy can be very right or it can be very wrong. But philosophy is seeking to understand and to have wisdom, and so it's not a bad thing. But again, we don't want to subject Christ, the gospel, or the word to human reason. Once people get, and they do it today too. People love to they've come up with something and they think, oh, that's really great. They try to find something Christian in it. And sometimes there is, and sometimes it's forced. And that's what was going on then, even as it goes on today. The emergence of universities began to spring up in various places. Schools, right? Scholasticism began to spring up around Europe. And so this pushed it along. There were three general schools of thought among the scholastics. The realists, these followed Plato. The moderate realists, who were more inclined to follow Aristotle, and the nominalists, who disagreed with both Plato and Aristotle. So a little bit about these. The first one we'll call the Platonic, meaning of Plato, realists. There's two great things that Plato wrote. One has to do with what the perfect society would be. Plato's Republic is what it's called. And it's a great work, and I'm more interested in talking about that maybe than some of these other things when it comes to Plato. But that's not what our topic is, so I'll just move on. There's another great writing of Plato that kind of captures some of what Platonic realism is all about. He wrote a piece called The Allegory of the Cave. And the allegory of the cave is quite interesting, and it does have spiritual truth behind it, whether or not he understood that or not. In the allegory of the cave, and I'm going to simplify the story, make it short, there's a man who is chained inside of a cave. He cannot see outside, as all he sees is the wall that is across from him, and there's shadows being projected onto this wall because there's light coming in and there's things happening over here, putting shadows, like a shadow puppet show, right? But he doesn't know that, as all he sees is this. And so he sees that and he thinks that is reality. What he doesn't understand, according to Plato, is that the reality is what is casting the shadow. Now, this concept is not far away from some biblical truth. We read about the Old Testament, and we see Paul talks about these in Colossians as being the things in the Old Testament are shadows of the thing to come, shadows of the real thing, and the real thing is Christ. Now, here's what realism says. The things that we see in our world, material things, this is an allegory, right? This is not a true story about the man in the cave. He sees things and he thinks that's reality, and indeed he's looking at the reality that we see in life, but what he doesn't realize at first is that all of those realities that he thinks are real are cast by their shadows of a true reality. Okay, so here's realism. Platonic realism says everything we see in our world is not really the truth. There's a spiritual reality back of them, and we're just seeing the images and shadows. Now, that's not an entirely bad concept, but we don't want to carry that too far, especially if that makes it sound like what is real really isn't even real. Anselm was a scholastic. He lived from 1033 to 1109. He sort of synthesized Christianity and Platonic philosophy with these words, "I believe in order that I may know." And folks, that's good. In Christianity, you cannot figure out the reality of the gospel. You have to receive the revelation, and once you believe, then you can know. Okay? Now that's not a bad sort of philosophical way to think. It is in some ways biblical. Anselm gave us what we call the ontological argument for the existence of God, and we're not going to take time to go into that, although it is interesting. Just simply to say, because we exist and because everyone has a concept of a supreme being in their minds, God must exist. See, here's the idea. Everybody believes that there is a God, so there must be something casting this shadow of a reality that we can't really see, but we see things that tell us that it's true. By the way, if any of you are tuning out at this point, thank you for joining us this far. Anselm's thinking shed a new light on the atonement, however, and here we get a little bit of some interest. Prior to this time, many conventional Christian thinkers believed that Christ's atonement for us was primarily a ransom. You know how he talks about he came to pay a ransom? Jesus came to pay a ransom. Earlier, many people believed that ransom was a ransom paid to Satan to buy mankind back for God, whereas Anselm correctly understood that Jesus died to pay a debt of sin that man owes to God, a debt which man could not pay. Now, what does that have to do with realism? Who knows? But I just bring that up, that in history, Anselm was good about some things and not so good about other things, and just like everybody else. Well, that's a little bit. I'm not going into any depth because, the deeper we go, the more befuddled we might become.